Okay, it's nice to see many familiar faces here. My name is Swee Liang, and I will be moderator for today's session. This session is jointly organized by the Economic Society of Singapore and School of Economics, Singapore Management University. We're very privileged today here to have Professor Lee Soo-An, and he will share with us on the topic of the role of higher education in Singapore's economic growth. Before I pass the time to him, I would like to invite President of ESS, Professor Houston Kwah, to give the opening remarks. Yeah? And Professor Houston Kwah is the President of the Economic Society of Singapore. He's also the Albert Winsemer's Professor Chair, and he's also the Director of the Economic Growth Center at the School of Social Sciences at the Nanyang Technological University. So, Houston, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Swee Liang. I'm not here to make any long speeches and so on, but I think it is important to thank our speakers who are willing to spend time with us talking about this important topic. And I'm glad to see actually some friends are here as well. And so anyway, Professor Lee Soo-An, I've known Soo-An for a very long time. So when I joined NUS back in the late 80s, I think Soo-An was the Dean of the Faculty of Accountancy and Business around that time, around that era, right? And ever since that, we have kept in touch with many good exchanges and discussions along the way. And Soo-An has been very active in all our society activities as well. So I thank you today for your willingness to spend the time to talk about this very important topic. And joining Soo-An is Professor Arnold Meyer, who I think many of you will know is the former president of SMU, in which we are very grateful as well to thank our host, SMU, for sharing this venue with us today. And so we welcome Professor Meyer. And Professor Arnold Meyer, by the way, has written a very interesting book as well on the building higher education in Singapore. And that was just a few years ago, as I recall. Yeah. So, of course, Professor Meyer would be a great discussant and commentator on these important aspects of education, higher education in Singapore. And Professor Michael Sin, Dr. Michael Sin, our council member of the Economic Society of Singapore as well. Some of you particularly may be interested in Michael's other more important portfolio, which is he head of the stock exchange, right? He's also the MD of SGX. So he will share, I think, the comments basically on higher education and his relationship with the stock market, the financial markets and so on, and developments along the way. So Singapore is very much lacking in resources. We have only particularly human resources. So there was a lot of investment in human resources from the time that Singapore became independent in 1965 to now. And I think that is something that Singapore does very well. But I think there's perhaps not as much write-up on the aspects of this investment in human capital, apart from what we normally hear. Now, of course, times have also changed, and along the way, it is important to see how we need to move higher education along the complexities of the modern world to train our students to become graduates of tomorrow, so that they're more in touch with what's going on in this changed, complex world. And I think so. That's the crux of today's session actually, where we talked about the development of education from the early independent days to now and to the future. So I thank Swee Liang for chairing this session, and Swee Liang will give a more detailed introduction of each of the speakers. So please enjoy yourself spending time here listening to our three great speakers. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I will now do a formal introduction of our speaker and two panelists. So Professor Lee Soo-An entered the University of Malaya as an undergraduate in 1956. He then taught at the University of Malaya in Singapore and University of Singapore. Subsequently, he taught at the National University of Singapore in various departments. This was the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, the Department of Business Administration, and the Department of Economics. He also taught at the Nanyang Technological University, thank you, at the College of Commerce as an adjunct professor, and more recently, he was here at Singapore Management University, teaching as well as an adjunct fellow. His two most recent books, the first is Singapore From Place to Nation, published by Pearson in 2019, and the book that I like also is the book called God and Money, published by the Bible Society of Singapore in 2019. Prof. Lee was economic advisor to the United Overseas Bank, and he was on the board of two of its subsidiary companies. He also sat on the board of Jurong Town Corporation, the Port of Singapore Authority, the National Productivity Board, and he was also at the Board of Trustees of the University of Singapore. So without much further ado, if you could now join me to welcome Professor Lee to give his talk on the role of higher education in Singapore's economic growth. And then I'll formally introduce the panelists when they come on board. Yes, I can help you with that. Hang on, Yeah, okay.
Thank you for the introduction, Sridhar.
You're welcome.
My colleague and I was a young fellow here, and my attachment arose out of my closeness to SMU in two ways. I was teaching at NUS. Then I thought I'd take a break, and then I switched to teaching at SMU and LKY school. And I found that my teaching in all three places, NTU, SMU, and NUS, the one which touched me most was the one in SMU. There are two reasons for that. First of all, when I taught here, I found that in my class, my grandson was there. This was in the School of Social Sciences. Yeah. So anyway, SMU was quite good in providing a professor there, Ho Kong Wing, to be the moderator for my marking. But despite that, my grandson got an A. He was very happy about that. But the other reason is that I went to visit him, and he was doing a term in a foreign university. So guess where would a Singaporean student want to spend a term as an exchange student in another country? Now, from my experience, most students who go on exchange, they want to go to America, Europe, England, and so on. But my grandson was exceptional, and I think that was partly because he's an SMU student. They are exceptional in certain ways. Can anybody guess what country did my son go to spend one term as an exchange student? All of you who are going to university will know that you can spend a term outside in another campus. Any guess?
Africa.
No. He went to Israel. There's a university, the Herzliya campus outside Tel Aviv. And was in English, but he made many Jewish friends and so on here. And I visited him there, and we toured Israel with my other grandson here. Then a question arose my mind. In Singapore, we have 6 or 7 state universities. They all have exchange programs. How many of them have a campus in Israel? Only one, SMU. Now, how come SMU got an exchange campus in Herzliya? So maybe the ex-president can explain that. But I found the reason. Because SMU was founded on the Wharton model, and there were Wharton professors here. And Wharton has a very strong Jewish component. So the Jewish professors ensured that SMU had an exchange program with this Herzliya campus. Herzliya campus is part of Hebrew University. So you can see the very special nature of SMU, which gravitated me to suggest that we hold this talk in SMU rather than in NUS or NTU or elsewhere. And of course, I taught here 3 or 4 years in adjunct faculty. I found the teaching very much invigorating. You have a small class. The students are more chatty. In NUS, the students never answer you. And I enjoyed my stay here. But now I'm back in NUS. I switched my entire teaching portfolio. I used to teach the Singapore economy from the economic history perspective. I think I wrote a book on the economic history of Singapore. There are many books on Singapore, but none, I think, deal with the economic history. The history of Singapore, which is largely political and cultural and so on. But the economic history is something which I hope all of you will want to learn more about after my talk. Now, my talk has a rather deceptive title. I noticed just now it was said the role of higher education in economic growth. And my answer is that the role is very limited. In fact, very little. And how did I propose to handle the topic today? When I prepared my slides, I used another title, Higher Education and Economic Growth. I didn't try to link the two in a growth model. Solo had a model where I think he postulated that maybe education can be the fourth factor of production. As you know, economic growth is caused by labor, capital, and land. But many unexplained components could be explained by a fourth factor. Could be education or technology or something like that. But I'm not going to explore that in this lecture. I think it's a bit too deep for many people, and I think there are many unresolved questions. So I want to treat growth and higher education as separate topics. And if you want to make a link, it's up to you to make a link. My main thesis is that economic growth came through certain events in Singapore's history, and education has another path line depending on certain factors. So the two tracks are in parallel, and there is some interaction, but I won't go into the interaction in some detail. Now, to understand, I must first locate Singapore in this. How do I place the pointer? No, yeah. Go ahead. The left. Okay. Spotlight or something. In this map, you find Singapore located within Southeast Asia. Now, right. Yeah. Right. No, I want to spotlight. Pointer. This one. Oh, yeah. When I was an undergraduate, Singapore did not have high economic growth, rather did it have good university. The universities I admired as an undergraduate were two. One is in Colombo, one is Yangon. Those two economies were more prosperous than Singapore because Ceylon or Sri Lanka is based on tea, Yangon is based on rice and timber and gems. Singapore was in big trouble. There was a communal strife and so on. And then now things are reversed. Singapore has much more higher economic level and a much higher educational standard. How did this happen? Now, we must first look at how Singapore grew. Now, Raffles started the free trade policy, but there's another thing he started. This was the free exit and entry of foreigners. Singapore had no people, so he had this policy in contrast to the Dutch and the French and the Germans, where if you enter the country, the colony, you had to learn a language, French or whatever it is. Singapore said, there's no need to learn English. You keep to your own language, and then you can come and go as you like, unlike the French and the Dutch, who were Singapore's neighbors. So Singapore had people, and the people came because of this policy. And they stayed in separate areas. This is the Jackson Plan of 1824, where people stayed in different parts of the city. They did not talk to one another. So this separation of races was the basis of education policy. There was no single policy to teach English. Each one kept their own schools, Chinese schools, Malay schools, Tamil schools. and the British used English only to talk to the leaders of the three racial groups and nobody else. So Singapore was not a nation, a country. There were just a lot of migrant people who came there because of the profits made by free trade. So this population growth was what happened to Singapore in the first 50 years. Very rapid population growth because of the two principles, free trade and also free exit and entry of people. But then came the expansion to the peninsular mainland. And this expansion came because of tin. It was found in Perak and then went to Selangor. And because the Malay rulers could not handle the Chinese miners, the British were called in to advise them. So the whole of this peninsula became the hinterland of Singapore. Singapore could not grow rich until this mainland also grew rich. Singapore's wealth was only in the spices trade in Southeast Asia. But with this peninsular mainland, this became the backbone of the Singapore economy. Many Singaporeans don't appreciate that actually without Malaya or Malaysia, there would be nothing. Singapore alone has nothing, no resources, no land, no commodities, except for some enterprising traders. And the traders was only done among spices. So these were the states, the 4 states formed the federation, and then the others were sort of unfederated states there. Now, Singapore grew because it was in a network, which is now the Belt and Road Initiative. There was the maritime route, the red color. There was the land route, the green color. And then people just all flocked to Singapore because it was so well connected, especially in the maritime sense. But what made Singapore grow was that it was part of the British Empire. The British Empire covered 2/3 of the world. And wherever the British were, people can find security. Because it's the biggest empire in the world in terms of geographical spread. It may not be in terms of that area, but it was to spread. And so Singapore grew as the cornerstone of the British Empire. And the thing which held the empire together was the Royal Navy. Because in the earth today, 3/4 of the earth is water, in case we don't realize it. We don't see it, it seems for granted, but 3/4 of the world is water, not land. And the one who controls the water controls the world. So the British Navy controlled the water. The British Navy defeated the French Navy, and before that, the Spanish Navy, the Portuguese Navy, and then they controlled the world. So the 19th century can be called the British century. The 20th century can be called the American century, and now we are in the 21st century. I think it can be called the Chinese century. Just to show you how the gravitation from one power to another takes place according to who controls the mode of communication. It was the sea, and the British controlled the sea, and the British controlled the world. Now, with this control by the British, Chinese came to Singapore, and Singapore became a Chinese nation. When Singapore was founded, the majority population was Malays. 2/3 of the people in Singapore, when Raffles came, were all Malays. The Chinese came much later, after the tin and rubber were discovered. Because Chinese miners knew how to mine tin, they came to Malaya. And then for the rubber plantations, Indians came over. They knew how to tap rubber. So without these immigrants, Singapore will be nowhere. So you find here, first, there's rubber over there, and this is tin, and then this is how Singapore grew as a port for Malaysia. Now this was not accidental. The British wanted to control, and they used Singapore as their base. So when they built the railways and the roads, they all moved down to Singapore. They did not go down to some other port. They go down to Japan, but not so. Everything moved down to Singapore, and that made Singapore into a financial center. Now, because the British controlled the world, they established the pound as the world currency. And Singapore and Malaya, when they issued their currency in 1899, the Straits dollar was based on the pound, and the pound was based on gold. And that's how the gold standard became the ruling currency for the world. Now, this is the biggest battleground outside China. Now, where is this? This is Singapore, and it is a place called Bukit Brown. There are 100,000 bodies buried there. Now, how come there's so many people buried in one piece of land? Because the people who came to Singapore were singles. They were male singles. From China, the emperor did not allow women to leave China. And only after the Second Opium War did they allow married women to leave China. My grandmother was one of those who was married, and therefore she could leave China in 1888 to come to Singapore. But the emperor was very clever. She knew that if women leave, the Chinese men, the whole family can move also. So he kept the women in China, not allowed to move. And so when single men came to Singapore, what happened to single men? There were no women to take care of them. And how did they spend their time? It wouldn't be prostitution, because there are no women around. So what did they spend their time on? They spent their time on opium. And the men were opium addicts. And Singapore became the biggest opium center in Southeast Asia. The British used opium to become rich. They exported Indian opium to China, and in turn they got Chinese silk, ceramics, and pottery, ceramics and tea, the three items which they wanted. They couldn't pay for it. They said, we'll sell you opium. And so they fought two wars, 1840 and 1860, to force China to buy opium. The emperor didn't want it. He said, this opium is going to kill my people. And true enough, they did. But the British won the war, and that's how China became the biggest buyer of opium. So the men in Singapore were opium smokers. You might wonder, how did Singapore survive? Free trade, no taxes. Where's the revenue to keep Singapore going? The British government was very clever. They sold the right to sell opium to some Chinese merchants. They are called opium farms. And the Chinese merchant would pay a sum to the British government for the right to sell opium. So the whole of Singapore was nothing but opium addicts. And opium addicts would die after a while. But opium sapped your energy and your nutrition and everything else. And today, you can still find this battleground. Part of it is now cut by a road, but I have friends who still trying to make sense out of all the tombstones. They can write the history of Singapore just by looking at the tombstone. Who was buried where and how are the families connected to one another. The whole history of Singapore can be found in the tombstones. Because to the Chinese, the most important thing in life is not when you are born, it's when you die. When you die, you must have a good burial, and you must be buried in the right place, a place on the hill slope facing China. That's their dream. Because they know they cannot go back to China, then they must die in Singapore, but die in dignity and in peace, which they did. So, what is the benefit of all these battlegrounds? Today, these battlegrounds are the richest parts of Singapore. You go to Takshimaya, it's built on the Teochew battleground. You go to any other place, all the best pieces of land that are commercially valuable now are actually former battlegrounds. And there's one for the Teochews, one for the Hokkiens, one for the Cantonese, and so on, all spread out. But in 1920, I think the British government consolidated all of them into one big battleground. Now, how come then Singapore had a population which can grow? This happened in 1911. The Sun Yat-sen is from China, but he organized a revolt against the emperor. And so he used Singapore as a base, in fact. to mobilize support. This was formed in 1911. The revolution toppled the emperor and of the republic formed. Today, this republic is called ROC, Republic of China. There's another republic formed in 1949, which is called PRC, People's Republic of China. But this was the first one. And today, Sun Yat-sen is even respected by the communists for being the first one to overthrow the Qing emperor. Now, how did this affect Singapore? That we find that because the republic was formed, China became a country. Before that, it was an empire. Now, the word for empire is Tikuo. The word for China as a country is Zhongguo. It's different. Ti means Huangti, the emperor. So, Singapore was part of the Zhonghua Tikuo. But under the emperor, there are no passports issued because the emperor is not a country. The emperor is actually, the empire is actually bigger than a country. So when you travel abroad, you just show your identification as having come from Xiamen. Then you are allowed to come to Singapore. You don't need a passport. But when this republic was formed in 1911, Sun Yat-sen said we are a country, you issue passports. And all Chinese can get a passport. And who are the first to take advantage of being able to have a passport? It's the women. Why? Because in 1930, the Japanese attacked China and they raped women. They were very cruel towards women, and many single women left China. Now, how can you leave China? What kind of jobs can you do? They came to the Nanyang, Singapore, among them. There are three things they can do. They can cook, they can sew, and they can take care of children. The three main jobs. So many Chinese women came to Singapore to support themselves and to have a new life ahead. And hopefully they meet all the single men who are there. The men who were smoking opium and so on. No female company. So women come, men here, they get married. And so they form families and the children. And many children. So my grandparents, for example, or my parents, for example, they got married in the 1930s there. And guess how many children they had? 6 children. I'm one of 6 children. But nowadays, families only have 1 or 2 children at a very early age. So the people who came to Singapore were many women. So women and children came to Singapore. They all took advantage to come to Singapore. Why? Because the British did not allow men to come to Singapore because of the Great Depression, 1930 to 1940. The world was hot. The rubber and tin factories collapsed. So the British government knew that the men cannot find jobs. But women, okay. The women know how to find jobs, either cooking or tailoring or house or taking care of children. So the floodgates were open. The women came, they met the men here, their children, and the population grew. So what changed was a population from migration, it changed to natural increase. So the number of babies born increased very fast. Initially, as you know, there was no natural increase. It was negative. More people died than were born. That's why there's so many burial grounds. But from then onwards, after that, from 31, later, all the increase was through natural increase. Why was there no migration? Because Mao Zedong took over China in 1949, and he stopped the Chinese from going out. Communist Party in control. And in fact, if you want to go to China, you probably won't be allowed to come out again. Some Singaporeans are very patriotic. When Mao Zedong took over, they said, let's go back and build up China. They went to China, they couldn't come back to Singapore. The British said, yeah, communists. We couldn't allow you to come back. So many Chinese men were caught when they went back to support Mao Zedong, the Singaporean Chinese men. But the Singaporean Chinese men who were here, they had children to take care of, and the population grew. And this led to a completely change of scenario. Now, this was confirmed by the Japanese coming to Singapore in 1942. they attacked Singapore, they conquered the British, and the country was renamed Nantou, the Light of the South. To me, the start of Singapore begins with the Japanese. Now, this is a bit strange. You know? We thought Singapore started with Lee Kuan Yew and Working Tea and all that. But they went through the Japanese occupation. They were all students, undergrads, when the Japanese came. And what you learn from the Japanese is the foundation stone of Singapore today. First of all, the Japanese did three things. Everybody must learn one language. Now before, as you know, the British allowed many languages to survive. Malay, Tamil, English. Japanese said, you must learn Nihongo. You must learn Japanese. Japanese schools were all over. And my father had to come he was a teacher in English, so he learned Japanese to teach you. Second thing the Japanese did was you must exercise. And the Japanese have a practice. Every morning you start your day with exercise. You don't start the day going to office, but you must exercise first before that. And thirdly, of course, you must obey the emperor, obedience. Before this, the people in Singapore sometimes disobeyed the British. But under Japanese rule, you cannot disobey. If you steal, your hands are cut off. You know, that kind of punishment is so very drastic that it made Japanese rule beneficial to the people of Singapore. They learn how to speak one language, they learn how to exercise, and they learn how to work together and obey all those above you. Obedience becomes a paramount trait of Singaporeans. Today we have this heritage where Singaporeans learn how to obey and we obey very quickly. Now, Singapore in 1946 had a unique problem, therefore. They had a very high rate of population increase and many children, maybe about, I think, nearly half of the people were actually children. And I remember when I was in school, there were so many children all in the streets. Well, their houses were very small. But today, what do we have? Now, these are all the people of Singapore. They are born in Singapore. They are young. Now, today, what do you have? You have a complete reversal. Singapore is now has foreigners in it here, and very high. The percentage, if you look at the foreigners, Singapore citizens only 3.5 million out of 5.69. So there's only about 70%, 60%. The rest are all foreigners. Some are PR, some are non-residents, and so on. And they're all very different categories. Now, what is different between the foreigners then and the foreigners now? In the past, when you're a foreigner, you can be assimilated into society. You can be given citizenship. Can all these foreigners be given citizenship? Yeah, you can apply. But you know, only 20,000 a year become citizens. I think the rate is probably 10 or 20% of those who apply. You apply for citizenship, by all means. I tell you, it's a very long and tricky process. But in the past, all foreigners can become citizens. My mother was not born in Singapore. She was born in Java. But when she came, the government had a rule in 1958. They created Singapore citizenship. Before there was no Singapore citizenship. You're a British subject or Dutch subject. My mother was a Dutch subject. She was born in Java. But when the PAP came to power in 58, or before that, under Lee Kuan Yew, I think, the Singapore citizenship was given to anybody who spent the last 10 out of 12 years in Singapore. No language test, no skills required from you, no certificates, you can become a citizen. So a 250,000 foreign-born became citizens in 59. And 59 was the year that PAP came to power. And who do you think voted them into power? It is all these 40 million foreigners, foreign-born, like my mother, who were so proud that they got citizenship, they voted for the PAP. And the PAP got into power because of this large block of foreigners who cannot speak English very well. And were not born in Singapore. They were born in the Dutch East Indies, or China, or India. But they all applied for citizenship, and they got it. And today, they're citizenship. But all these foreigners today cannot get citizenship. You ask them, how many times do they have to try? I know people who have tried 1, 2, 3 times. My own colleagues, they told me, they can't even get PR. Very difficult. So anyway, this is what Singapore become. A total reversal of what it was 10 years earlier. Now, let's go to higher education. Now, because there were all males in Singapore and all spice trade, private commodities, there was no need to have higher education. The only need was for doctors. The people were dying, so the KE7 College of Medicine was set up to produce doctors. Then in 1928, there was another institution set up, Raffles College, to train teachers for the schools and to train subordinates to the British civil servants. These two were then merged in 1949 into the University of Malaya. Now, how are the Chinese? These are all the English education. Now, the Chinese had a big desire for education. You know Chinese history, education is one of the pillars of Chinese civilization. One is the family, but the other is education. So, the Chinese had a lot of schools, primary schools, secondary schools. And then they formed a university on their own, Nantang, 1955. Imagine an ethnic group forming their own university. No other group would dare do it. Why? Because of the Chinese tradition of higher education. In China, there are 4 classes. There's the farming class, the craftsman class, the soldier class, and the scholar class. Now, which class is the thing the most important in Chinese society? It's a scholar class. Because to be an official in the government, you must pass the exam. And you sit in field exams. So the ambition of every Chinese mother is that children who can pass the exams and go to the very top. Because only those who can read and write Chinese can become rulers of the country. I think this is why, probably an explanation why Chinese is a difficult language. I think it's purposely made difficult to make sure that only very few can master Chinese and can run the country. So the educated class is number 1 in Chinese culture. And this was passed on to the Chinese who came to Singapore. Now the Chinese who came to Singapore were all traders. They were actually quite low class. But when they came to Singapore, they remembered that in China, what counts is education. And so the Chinese themselves, they built primary schools, secondary schools, and then they built a university in Singapore. Why did they build Nantang? Because China was closed by Mao Zedong in 1949. The Chinese schools cannot get the graduates of Chinese universities to come here to teach. Before 1949, all the teachers in the Chinese schools, Hua Chung, Chung Cheng, they're all graduates of Chinese universities. They came here, but when the border was closed, the Chinese secondary school students had no place to study, and so they formed their own university, not only just for the Chinese in Singapore, but also for the Chinese in Southeast Asia. That's why they call it Nanyang. Yang means ocean, Nan is south. It's a South Ocean University. It's not a Singapore university, but dealing with the whole of Southeast Asia. But for English education, you have a sequential development. I told you there was a college to produce doctors, then a college to produce teachers, that was college, and then they were combined into the University of Malaya. And then the Chinese formed their own university. But this is not registered as a university. It was registered as a company, a limited company. The Chinese merchants had no other way to form an institution except by registering as a private company. then because the salaries of these graduates were much lower than the salaries of the graduates of the University of Malaya, the Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew realized that this would lead to discontent. So in 1980, he merged the two, University of Malaya and Nanyang, into the University, or rather the University of Singapore, which was formed from the University of Malaya. But then it was merged with Nanyang University to form NUS in 1980. Now, who is the successor to Nanyang University? Oh, you say, oh yeah, of course, I know the answer. Nanyang Technological University, NTU. Wrong. The answer is wrong. Because when you look at this crest, where did Nanyang University become? You look at the crest of the NUS. The crest has got 3 circles. These 3 circles stand for Nanyang University. NTU is not the successor to Nanyang University. NTU is a totally new animal, so to speak. Born because it occupies the ground of Nanyang University. But educationally wise, the successor of Nanyang is NUS. And in order to force this through, Lee Kuan Yew hired a consultant from Britain, Frederick Dainton, for advice. But as you know, the joke is that when you want to do something and don't know how to do it, you hire a consultant. And the consultant will write the report which you want to see written. And in that way, you use the consultant's name to substantiate what you're going to do. So Dainton recommended, and Lee Kuan Yew accepted, and NUS was born in 1980. Now today, where do we stand? Now, education is 2.64% of the budget. Now, this is a few years ago, 2019. Health is next, 2.31, and so on. Now, one thing which struck me when I saw these figures, if you add up the figures, what is the total of the government budget as a percentage of GDP? You add up yourself. It comes to only 16%. Singapore has only 16% of the GDP as the government budget. It's one of the smallest shares of the government in the economy. You go to the US is 40%. Even China is more than that. Why is the share of the government budget so small in the GDP? Now, to update, I think the latest figure shows that health has overtaken education. Number 1 is defense, and number 2 is public development. The other 10% is actually defense, development, and so on. But the fact remains that the share of the government in GDP is 16%. Now could be more, at the most 18%, but it's not higher than that. It cannot cross 20%. Why? First of all, there are constitutional limitations. The budget has to be balanced over the period of office of the legislature, 5 years. And then the budget can only tap half of the returns from the reserves, not all the income, not all the returns. And even then, the returns are quite volatile. Why can't we increase taxes? Why can't we increase company tax, income tax? Because Singapore must remain competitive, so we cannot increase all these normal taxes. The only thing they can increase, which doesn't affect us, is GST, and that is probably what people must suffer, and it's equivalent to probably the opium tax in the Straits Settlement days. The government imposed the opium tax to raise revenue. So today, the GST is like an opium tax. Everybody has to pay GST. So this is the position that Singapore is stuck in. The government cannot increase its share of the budget. Another reason is that in Singapore, the fiscal system is tied to the monetary system. No other country has this connection. I think even Hong Kong has abandoned it. Because you find that you're following the currency board system. The Singapore dollar is the successor to the Swiss dollar, and therefore the Singapore dollar is still based on the currency board system. And I think no other country follows the currency board system. This means that the government cannot borrow from MAS. Singapore has a very big domestic debt, but no foreign debt. That's why the Singapore dollar is so strong. Why did the British invent the currency board system? This was the British way of getting money back from the colonies. The British government set up colonies, but they didn't do so because they love colonies. They want to make sure they get their money back from every colony they had. So they said, when a new colony is set up, all the reserves of that colony must be invested in England. So the currency board's assets are all in the UK. So this is how the British government exploited the colonies to support their own expenditure, as if they are wars or whatever. Currency board system is a unique feature of British colonialism. It's a way of exploitation. But in a way, it doesn't seem very distressing. But in monetary wise, it is. It takes away the reserves and puts it in UK to finance the British government debt. The reserves are not put to productive use in a country where it is issued, but rather in Britain. So now we come to changes in the higher education. Although the budget is limited, but education had to change. And Polytechnic was set up in 1955, and then the university was split up, one for KL, one for Singapore, and then technical stream was set up in the school system. It only began in 1966. Before that, all the schools were awarding academic program of instruction. And then later on, the poly was expanded to produce engineers and produce business and accounting staff in 1968. These are all the changes within the budget to make Singapore competitive globally. But it has to be done within a very limited budget. The budget cannot increase. This is a basic point, that Singapore cannot increase its total budget to accommodate education. But what happened? But the expansion of education. After NUS, there were 6 more funded universities. There was NTU in 1991. But actually NTU was formed after NTI. NTI was the first to be formed. Then SMU was founded in the year 2000. SUTD 2009. SUSS in 2017. And the latest is SIT in 2009. And another one coming up, University of Arts in 2021. Now, there's a question to ask. Why is this proliferation of university after NUS? What is the driving force? It's not because the government has money. There's still a constraint, but there are new things being done in educational scene. Now the budget is still 2%, 3% on education. But where are the children? No more children. This year, every year, there are 30,000 babies born. Last year, how many died in Singapore? 27,000. Singapore is aging. We are not growing in numbers, those Singapore born. We are a stagnant population. So, we don't need primary schools. We don't need secondary schools. They are being closed down. Every now and then you read, this school closed down, that school closed down, merger of junior colleges, and so on. So where is the momentum to educational expansion? Where did it come from? My answer is that the heads of these institutions have become very very innovative. These are all autonomous universities: NUS, NTU, SMU, SUTD, HSS, SIT. What the government does, they give a block grant to each university. So let me give an example of NUS. NUS, the budget is over $1 billion a year. But MOE wants to rein in NUS. How can he do so? So he told Tan Chai. He told me himself this: the MOE grant to NUS is going to be cut 10% every year. It used to be $800 million. Now it's being cut 10% every year. So what does he do? Chai expanded the development office. Development office is the fundraising arm of NUS. How many staff do they have? They have 70 staff, 70 full-time staff, trying to raise $200 million a year. And they ask who? People like me. to give. You say, you're alumnus, you must donate, and so on. It's one of the biggest departments in NUS, all devoted to fundraising. It's bigger than the alumni office because it makes money. For studying time was fine. 10% cut from this grant. Now what do the other institutions do? I think they all have fundraising outfits, but I think they have to be very creative. So I'm told that in SUSS over here, I have a former TA who is teaching there now. She tells me she's being paid fees rate. She's giving a small amount to lecture, then she's paid so much for every script she marks. Every time there's an assignment to be done, she must record how many scripts she marked, how many hours she spends on talking to people, and then they'll pay her. So it's not a salary. I get paid a salary regardless whether I have students or not. So last term I taught a course in NUS. Guess how many students I had? I only 10 students, but I get the same pay as somebody who had 100 students or 200 students in NUS. We are paid a lump sum. We are not paid piece rate. But HSS has to do it because HSS has to survive. And they do it because the budget is limited. They're not as good as others. So I don't know what the answers are for all. How did the CEOs of these campuses raise funds? Let me give you an example of what I did. I was the Dean of Accountancy and Business in 1980. And I had one staff, quite a bright chap. In fact, he joined SMU later on. I think Arnold knows him. His name is Tan Chin Tiong. And he came from Pennsylvania State University. And he told me, his PhD was from there, he told me that they had an executive program in Penn State. So he told me to start one. So I wrote into the trustees and asked them, can I set up a management development fund? And all the proceeds of our executive courses are put into this management development fund. So true enough, Chin Cheong did that. He renovated a classroom and did other things to publicize our program. Another one of the biggest things I did was I had a visitor from Stanford. I was before that a scholar in Stanford. So I asked him across, and I had a dinner with him, and I brought along somebody who was a very impressive person. So he was taken aback, so he agreed. So the Stanford NUS program was started. The first time NUS combined with a major US university to run an executive program. Today it's still running, 30 years later. It attracts a lot of people. But we put NUS in the world map that here is a university in Southeast Asia whom Stanford links up with. No other university in America would do that. Harvard wouldn't do it, Yale wouldn't do it. They want money. They want money from you. If you pay money to Harvard or Yale, they will shut up a school here. But this was, no money was paid. We just divide income expenditure equally. How big was this fund created? About 10 years ago, the business school in Singapore had a new building. The donor only gave $20 million. The building cost $40 or $50 million. The business school swiped all the funds in the management development program to pay for the rest of the school. And that school is not called Riyadi School. The building is called Riyadi Building, but the school is NUS Business because he didn't pay up enough to have the whole school named after Riyadi family. But what I'm trying to tell you is that if you're innovative, you can raise money. And that's how many universities in Singapore can keep thriving. So today the question I want to ask you, how much more higher education do you want to have in Singapore? Who's going to pay the price? Can the government pay it? The government has a very strict budget. Can the CEOs of the universities raise money on their own? I don't know. This is an open question to anybody to answer. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Lee. So if I may, I would like to invite Professor Arnold de Meyer and Dr. Michael Sin to the seats. And I would also, in the meantime, I'd like to give a formal introduction to our two panelists, please. Arnold, you're over here. Michael? Okay. So Professor Arnold de Meyer is a Professor Emeritus and former President of Singapore Management University. He is an internationally recognized researcher in R&D and innovation management, manufacturing strategy, and international management. Currently, he is chair of the Temasek-sponsored Stewardship Asia Center based in Singapore, and he's also independent director of several listed companies. He recently published Ecosystem Edge, Sustaining Competitiveness in the Face of Disruption, and also a book on Building Excellence in Higher Education, Singapore's Experience. Dr. Michael Sin is a Senior Managing Director and Head of Equities of SGX Group. Mr. Sin has management responsibility for SGX equity businesses, serving as CEO of the stock market, depository, and futures market. Prior to this role, he led the exchange's successful derivatives in equities, commodities, and currency assets. He joined SGX Group in 2011 with a background in investment banking and investment management. Mr. Sin serves on the Council of Economic Society of Singapore and the board of Sentosa Development Corporation. He chairs One Favor Group, which is one of Singapore's leading operators of a suite of leisure and lifestyle services, anchored around the Singapore Cable Car Sky network of 6 stations. He graduated MA and PhD from Cambridge University and attended the Harvard Advanced Management Program. Please join me to welcome the panelists here. Thank you. So to kickstart, I have 2 questions for the panelists. And but before that, okay, hang on. I would also like to encourage the participants, if you have any questions, you can ask your questions from where you are seated. Just raise your hand, identify yourself, your name, and your affiliation, all right? For those of you who are more shy, we have also put up a screenshot of the QR code to WooClap. So we welcome all questions. But in the meantime, if I could just get the discussion started, 2 questions for the panelists. I have a lot of aha moments, to be honest. If I may, I would like to share one of them, which is very personal, Prof. Lee. When you shared about women coming from China to Singapore, the single ones, it brought back a lot of fond memories because there was my grandma. She actually came in a junk boat, in an arranged marriage, to be married to my akong. And being single, she traveled alone, a single woman from China in a junk boat. And Prof. Lee, in that junk boat, she met another young woman, and she told me that under the moonlight, they swan and they become swan sisters. And they were very, very close, So that story really struck a chord in me. Thank you for highlighting about that journey that my grandma took. So that was my personal aha. So for me, two questions, for Anu and Michael. Perhaps if you could share with the audience what you found was interesting, perhaps your own aha moment. It can be personal, it can be technical. And my second question is, in the things that Prof. Lee has shared, was there anything that supports, a supporting or a differing point of view? And it could be anything. So perhaps, Anu, if I could start off with you first. Yes.
There were many aha moments. First of all, I have to say I'm still a foreigner.
Oh, you didn't get
one
your...
of those foreigners who can't get a Singapore nationality, but I'm a PR, and this is home for me, so let me make that very clear. Secondly, nothing really essential to the talk, but I'm a very, I go very often walking in Bukit Brown, and I see all these tombstones there. Very alone there. I usually see only other Angmos, because we probably are not so well related to the ghosts there. So we can do it quietly there. It's a very nice place to walk, but it's also a very good place to discover what the original vegetation is actually basically in Singapore. It's a nice place. But what struck me, what's the sort of maybe not the aha moment, the question of is education actually contributing to economic growth? And Michael may have perhaps a different view on that, but for me, and of course I'm not an economist, I have to say, by the way. I'm sort of a strange animal here because I'm an engineer. But for me, there is clearly a link that goes from education to economic growth. And I'm backed up by some studies by the OECD in that. Now, I know that these relationships are often very difficult to make, but I'm very much convinced, like the founding team here in Singapore, that the only natural resources we have in Singapore is people, and that if we can improve the quality of these natural resources, these people, that actually that will contribute to economic growth. Now, I have to say that the link is not immediate, and I just heard that Michael was in Cambridge. I used to work in Cambridge too, but you probably don't know that there are two universities in Cambridge. There is the University of Cambridge, and then there is Anglo-Ruskin University. Anglo-Ruskin University is a university that was created out of a polytechnic about 30 years ago in 1992, when the United Kingdom decided to transform its polytechnics into applied universities. The reason why I mention that is that if you study history at University of Cambridge, you probably will get a good job afterwards in finance or in whatever, because it's a university that creates or stimulates your thinking, your critical thinking, and that you can apply in many different ways. If you study history at Anglo-Ruskin University, you probably won't find a job. On the other hand, if you study nursing at Anglo-Ruskin University, you probably will be very much in demand. And Cambridge University doesn't have nursing. It doesn't even have, many other topics. So the point that I want to make with that little example is that, and don't take it too strongly, but the point I want to make with this example is education does contribute to economic growth, but not automatically. You really have to think through. And that leads me to the second aha moment or comment that I have on what Prof. Lee has been saying when he was showing the last slide, where he showed the evolution of Singapore's higher education system from 1990, where there was one university, the then NUS, to today where we have 7 universities. And at the same time you can say, and I dare to say this as a foreigner, that, and a somewhat insider, outsider, that actually when you look at the system that Singapore today has, it's probably one of the best systems in the world. System of higher education. I'm not talking necessarily about each of the individual universities. We all like to show off our rankings. We all like to show off what we're good at. And that's purely competitive behavior. That is, we try to attract you students to come to our universities, and we have this competitive behavior. But if you look at the system as a whole, and that's what the book that I wrote recently is all about, when you look at how the different universities interact with each other, it is actually a very good system. And that system is so good for, I mean, there are many reasons in the book, but I will mention three here. That is, first of all, it is actually fit for use. And what do I mean by fit for use? The different universities were created at moments that Singapore's evolving economy needed perhaps different types of graduates. I'll take the example of this university because I know it best, but it applies to SUTD, it applies to SIT, it applies to SUSS, etc. It applies to all universities, apart from NUS, that was always there. That is that when we say a major change in the economic development of the country, we have actually created an institution that could provide people that can work in that new sector. And SMU was created around 2000 because at that moment we saw a huge increase in services, professional services, finance, the need for accountants, the need for, this is the law school, the need for lawyers, additional lawyers, etc. So the university was really created when we moved into professional services. And SUTD was really created as Singapore University for Technology and Design when the government wanted to see the economy moving in towards a more innovative, innovation-oriented economy. So fitness for use, but also because you, and I see lots of young people here in this room, have growing desires in what you want to study. Professor Lee was indicating that in the beginning of the 20th century, you could only study here medicine or become a teacher of English. And it was a very limited choice that you would have. Today, you, or those among you who still want to go to university, probably want to have a smorgasbord, a sort of a big breakfast layout of what can I do, what can I study. And I think one of the great things about having 7 universities today is that we have choice. That you, I mean, not me anymore, but you have choice, right? And you can go to study different disciplines, but also in different styles. You can go to NTU, which is really a nice, isolated campus where you all work together, or you can be in the middle of the city, as you are here at SMU. Some of us like one, some of us like the other. What the government has been doing, and that is my fitness for use, that is creating universities that actually respond to the needs in the economy, and secondly, create a variegated offer so that you as young Singaporean citizens can actually choose. The two other ones that I will mention here that are important, I think, in terms of success rate of the sort of educational system, higher education, supporting economic growth. The two other ones are the enormous investment that the Singapore government has made in research and development, the RIE plan, the Research, Innovation and Enterprise Plan for 2025, for these 5 years in which we are living, is about 25 billion Singapore dollars. And the bulk of that goes to the universities, and that's one of the other ways we finance universities. Not only based on education, but also on the bulk that goes to research and development, in particular to the research-oriented or research-based universities. And that is, I think, a major change that has happened over the last 20 years. And the third success factor, from my perspective, and that's answering a little bit the question about that Prof. Lee asked, how, with the limited budgets that we have, can we actually create 7 universities that are on top of that so successful? It has to do with how the government has organized ourselves as autonomous institutions, as companies that are limited by guarantee. So in fact, you could argue that the universities are private institutions with all kinds of constraints and rules and policy contracts and whatever. I don't want to go into it, but it leaves us, and I was a president of a university, it left us with a lot of freedom is maybe not the word, but space, slack within which we can manage the universities. And that is a good system, because with that autonomous approach, what you get is very different universities, because you have different people leading them and they have a different way of doing things. So you get very different universities, which is good for you to have choice as a Singapore system. And secondly, we have to become creative in how do we finance these universities. And Prof. Lee has already indicated some fundraising. He indicated executive education, but I can tell you there are many more ways that we can learn from others in how to manage universities and make them not private institutions, but institutions that are creative in finding the resources to make sure that we can provide good education. That's when I've been talking backwards.
Thank you, Arnold. Because I think what you shared also was, declining birth rates. But on the other hand, the government always consistently talk about, skills futures and lifelong learning. So there's always that pool of, people that we could target. No, lifelong learning. Talk about lifelong learning. Okay, thank you very much for the insights. I'll get probably your reactions, to Arnold's in a while. But meantime, maybe Michael, what perhaps will be your key aha.
Someone who's run a university, and there's so much to unpack here. So I'm the sort of token mercantilist here. So eventually, I think I have to address the 2 questions which Prof. Lee has tabled, and Arnold as well. Which is one is partially education as an industry, and therefore we need to look forward. What is the nature of the demand for the product of higher education? What's it going to look like in 10, 20 years? But as importantly, and it's a very closely intertwined question now, I think, is education as a matter of social and public policy. But this also comes into the way that education as an industry will necessarily evolve. Why does this come about? Very simply, because we're approaching the potential 4th industrial revolution. It's as simple as that. So the history of education as an industry is well understood. For a long time, it was classical in nature. You go to a selective university, you learn the classics, you learn history, and that's enough to equip you to function in the 1st industrial revolution. And very rapidly, we know this happened, particularly in the US, when the 2nd industrial revolution hit. Privately funded research university, undertaking, I guess, a more European model of graduate research. Those universities took root: Chicago, Stanford, Caltech, and we can spend hours on the Stanford example. Right? The value creation in California through military funding, the sort of cheap land and cheap labor that came from Stanford has been world-changing and tremendous. And the same is happening in China today. So in the 2nd generation, you had to pivot. Research was a very important part of education as an industry. And as we headed into the 3rd, we still are there, the 3rd industrial revolution, something, particularly over COVID, has happened, which is, I think there's a realization that there's a part of education which is, or higher education, which is intensely personal and synchronous, and that's the teaching element that you cannot replace. And there's a part of higher education which can now be micro-stacked, decomposed, and done on a MOOC, right? Massive online distribution. So much free material out there, so much ability to reach out. So as we all head into this next generation, and the topic of discussion, both in in middle school education, higher education, is how much of the skills that you've picked up is replaceable by generative AI. And ChatGPT that you see today It's nothing close to what you'll see next year. It's nothing close to what you'll see in the next 5, 10 years. It's already demonstrated an ability to do the sort of work that I would expect an intelligent intern to do. Right? It's not making decisions, it's just a large language model. So the question then is, as you approach this fourth industrial revolution, the utopian in me says that we're going to hit a series of technological breakthroughs which are exponential in nature. This is known as the singularity, meaning we're post-scarcity. We transcend biology, right? A lot of the skills that you needed to turn up at the workforce to get trained in higher education, those are no longer needed. And the only way that society survives is through some, it's called the universal basic income, meaning society keeps stable by paying all of you a living wage so that you don't have to work for a living. If you work, it's for purpose, and for everyone else, we need to educate you how to spend your time when you don't have a job. So this is a utopian view. So the purpose then of education as an instrument of social and public policy is higher education in particular, is probably to equip you with deep knowledge of certain things so that you can be a more active citizen, so that you can guide the way society grows. Because the shape of the economy will be transformed. The shape of the market mechanism, which is deep within economies, and this is the industry I work in, right? Many things are made through market networks. Many decisions are rooted and transmitted through mercantilist market networks. And a deep knowledge of how humans behave in a context of high computational workload, that's going to be very important. And this is something that school doesn't equip you for. You do need to go to higher education to deeply understand certain topics in nano or molecular engineering, in computational engineering. So the net outcome of this, I think, is that higher education may well revert to where it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, which is more selective for those elements which are publicly funded. And I think the burden of choosing to pursue higher education falls back on the individual, because many of the returns will be private in nature.
Interesting insights. So we get less subsidies in that regard if the returns are more private than social. Yes. Okay. I would like, there's so many interesting insights,
There's
from
so many
Prof.
interesting
Lee.
questions.
Yes, yes, yeah. There's so many of them, but maybe I'll just start with the floor first, and I'll see how it goes, all right? So please, if you have questions, burning questions, raise your hand, identify yourself, and yes, please.
Sure. I'm Maureen DeRoy. I'm a council member at the Economic Society and a Dean's Fellow at SMU, so I have to be here. I'm also a Singapore citizen, actually, very lucky to be there. There's hope, Arnoud. But I've always been very intrigued with academia and how it connects to business, because I've been a banker my whole life and recruited heavily from SMU in my last position. How do you keep that connection? Because I think what we hear now is it's important that people are capable to enter the workforce, but there's so much that we don't know. If we look at progressing technology, etc., we always come back to critical thinking, but that's a very wide concept, right? So how does education get shaped in any of these universities we currently have, and how does it remain or become cost effective if we have the pressure of government money going down and having to get money through other means? How do you balance that and not miss out on true solid academics? It seems to be such a problem. And I know that's a lengthy question, but how do we make academia continue to be relevant for all the people here to find a job in a future we can't quite define? We have ideas about it, but we can't quite define. How do you do that without endless money?
Yes.
Or getting more commercial?
And limited resources.
Complex
Yes.
question. I'm sorry to do that to you, but
Who would like to start first?
Well, why don't I start?
Yep.
Again, that's a huge question to unpack. I would say that the lessons of COVID are instructive. Because new areas, and you're all probably, the younger ones will be very familiar with all the happenings in crypto and blockchain. And the people who are at the root of this quite tremendous revolution in thinking about what decentralized finance is, these were not necessarily the best educated people in terms of formal higher education, but they were deeply intelligent, and they had interesting backgrounds across cryptography, economics, computer programming, which are things that you would not normally string together in a university education. So Ethereum, as an example, is because Vitalik, who's, you know, in his first year, University of Waterloo, but an intensely, deeply intelligent man who was stuck on the internet over COVID and decided, I'm going to roll up a global network that has a special form of economics that makes it self-sustaining and is Turing complete so it can compute on any node. Like, that's just an idea that 10 years ago, just because you had an idea, you could not go to market with it. So what I'm saying is that as we get more digitalized, computerized, the ability for someone to float initiatives with inherent monetary economics in the system has become much, much higher. And the necessity for structured formal education for a large employer, that's become a more nuanced thing that as government, as society, you may not choose to fund that, right? It's something that you as a private individual may choose to fund. Now, large employers, consulting firms, audit firms, banks, I think the era of that method of approaching the workforce, I think that's coming to an end. It used to be, I mean, probably around the time that SMU started, that this was a logical way to go to market. You get trapped by one of the early reservoirs, right? I go to one of the big four, I go to Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, I go to whatever, an audit firm, and from there, I will just swim down this reservoir for the next 30 years, and my jobs will all kind of derive from that. That ability to just have a general degree with some amount of social prestige and pre-selection, which is attested to by the university. If I went to Stanford and got whatever GPA, that's a form of pre-selection. Today, the way I see assessments being done, that matters a lot less because employers now choose to do assessments. In fact, the first 2 rounds of assessment, you know, if you guys are going through job assessments, first 2 rounds are entirely automated. You talk to a robot, you speak to the robot, you do a test online, right? So the prestige that comes, that gets conferred by having a degree, a well-scoring degree from a good university, that becomes more on the private network. It's no longer for job selection. So the status, the value to which you ascribe the mix between private returns and public returns for a really good education at a really good university, that will continue to evolve. There will always be that because of this desire to be labeled whatever, a PhD. You look at Korean politicians and German politicians, even if they don't have one, they'll buy one, they'll cheat, they'll, you know, whatever, they'll study, but everyone seems to want a PhD now. So that social prestige will still be there, but the need for higher education, I think, particularly in finance, it's not obvious that you need higher education.
I will disagree with that. Being a former professor, I've been in this job quite a long time. You may have noticed they call me emeritus. Those among you that think this has anything to do with merit, you're totally wrong. I mean, the word emeritus comes out of Latin, and I'm still one of those people who had to study a lot of Latin in my own country. And it comes from ex merere, and ex merere means you're out of game. In other words, you don't earn any money anymore. That's what emeritus means. You don't earn money anymore. I've come to the stage that I'm now an emeritus, so don't gain money anymore, but also I've been a long time in this business. And where I disagree with Michael that we wouldn't need higher education anymore if you want to go into finance. By the way, you could get very wrong things in finance these days if I read the press. But anyway, you could do very wrong things. But the point I really want to make is that the way we teach in higher education will have to change. And I make it very simple, a bit black and white, but I'm old enough, and that's the reason why refer to the emeritus, to remember the 80s when I started to teach, and then I was a sage on stage, right? The wise person who was on the stage and who was sharing knowledge with the students. In the late 90s, mid-90s to late 90s, I saw the classrooms changing to what this is. And this is not anymore to share knowledge, but it is actually to interact with students. So where I was a sage on stage, we suddenly become at the same level when we were interacting with each other. Those among you who would know something about what I did here at SMU know that I actually very much invested in a next evolution of education, which is called experiential learning, and where we forget about rooms like this, where you are in flat rooms, working together in teams with each other to solve problems. And the feeling, or the reason why I sort of introduced this university-wide, not some kind of experimental courses, but university-wide, is that I strongly believe that if you want to learn what the sage on stage could tell you in the 80s, you better go to YouTube. You can, or you were referring to the MOOCs. I'm in the board of directors of an educational technology company. The amount of online, high quality, I'm going to say videos, but it's actually a complex set of different types of media. The amount that is on there, and then where you can learn the basics, and it's for free in many cases. Now, I'm in a company where we try to sell it, but we know that we compete with things that are actually quite free. So you can't, you don't need the university anymore to learn the basics. But what you don't learn is how to apply it, how to avoid that you become FTX and forget about what the basic principles are of good governance and things like that. And that's what the critical thinking is that you were talking about, Maureen. That is in helping young people to understand not what they need to know, but how to apply what they know, and how to keep on learning. And that, of course, universities have been investing heavily in adult learning, because I also come out of a time that when you were graduating with your PhD, that you had a license for life. Nowadays, you have to constantly re-educate yourself, learn new things. And so the two elements for me of higher education are application, knowing how to do it, and secondly, knowing how to keep on learning. And that there will still be need for higher education.
Sorry. Different insights, but very different.
It's an industry.
Yes. Yes. Prof. Lee, please.
I think you mentioned a new dimension of higher education. I think about 15 years ago, the government set a target of having 150,000 foreign students in Singapore. And today, I think we only reached about 70,000. What I'm trying to say is that Singapore can be a place for foreign students to come to. There are many barriers to overcome. Housing, for example. Students find it too expensive to study here because the housing cost is very high. I'm thinking of a country like Australia and America. They attract thousands of foreign students. And some of them are rich, of course. But what was happening is that in their education system, they allow for different entry paths into the higher education sector. They don't have a uniform platform. Here in Singapore, we have the A-levels and the IB. I have a daughter studying in Australia in a university. But you know, she's studying a creative design institute. She's doing a bachelor's in animation. Now, animation, 3D animation, doesn't require A-levels or IB. You must have a good eye, good digital skills. Now, the Singapore system allows for various modes of entry, and not just the rigorous A-level or IB. If you want to attract foreign students, we must allow for different pathways to go on studying. And we shouldn't socially stratify people, like what school you come from, what A-level or O-level or whatever it is. And I think it's a big tool to sustain our 6, 7 universities. We need foreign students. Singapore is not producing enough bodies. There's not enough children being born every year, that's all. It's a long-term problem, and we can't solve it overnight. But we can attract foreign students. But we must create a campus where accommodation is cheap, where the instruction is not based just on the structured learning. So I have shared Michael's viewpoint. Somehow we must allow different pathways and permit foreigners to study here. Singapore is surrounded by very heavy populous countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines. But I'll be reaching out to them. NUS President Tan Hing Chai was so proud. He told me that NUS has an overseas college system. You can go and study 2 or 3 years in overseas college. But he started one in Indonesia. I think the first in Gajah Majah, and the campus where NUS students can go and study. So we need a counterpart, not only exchange students, but overseas campuses where Singapore students can go abroad, and also a campus where foreign students can come here and be able to assimilate into our education, but not follow the Singapore system so rigorously, so tightly. Our standards are too high, I can see, and sometimes it's meaningless. And our students who come for the poly are actually better than those who come with A-levels or IB. So let's open up our entryways and open up our educational scene to embrace a bigger market for the future.
I hope through the sharing, because I've been going through some of the questions, like should we invite more foreign talent into our higher education institutes? I think Prof. Lee has already answered that by saying that we have 6 institutes here, and we can't limit the intake of foreign students here. I'm mindful of the time that we end at 6:30. We are already 2 minutes past here, and I think some of you may have other commitments. So if you could please join me to thank our esteemed speaker and panelists, and on behalf of Professor Scott. And a big shout out to this seminar would not have been possible without all the administrative support. So Vivian, if you are here, thank you so much from Economic Society of Singapore. And then there is also Linda, Peiti, and Ching Ching. So on behalf of everyone, thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.